still a little tired myself. So thanks for showing up for Dnsop in Singapore. It's a much smaller crowd, but I think we kind of expected that. So I'm Tim, and that's Suzanne. We need a Jabber scribe. If someone wants to sign up, usually Mr. York is really great at that, but he's not here. So if someone could sort of own up to some responsibility. So no. So we'll have to find somebody. Joel, thank you, Joel. Short hair Joel will be Jabber scribe, so we thank you for that. So, and Mr. Hoffman's taking minutes, so he may ask you for your name or for better spelling. Do you use the Etherpad? No, he does not. Okay. The note well, since it's Monday, I guess you may not have seen the note well. This should be the new improved one. Please take a look. Basically, everything you say is sort of out there. So
everything you say is part of the proceedings.
Yep. And the blue sheets are going around, you know that, so please fill those in so they know how many people we need. So this is good. It's the scurrilous people showing up. I knew they'd all show up like 9:45. There's Jeff and Joe. This is perfect. So some agenda bashing, some document updates. We've got some current business and some new working group business to go through. Since our last meeting, basically, the one thing that sort of came out was the TLD problem statement draft got published, which was sort of a long, arduous process. And I seem to have a great preview fail there. So in working group last call, we have 2 documents that basically are expired, but we're waiting on the authors to update their drafts. The all TLD one, there's some stuff that they have to get. And the refuse any draft, which Joe has promised me twice already that he's going to have an update this week. He's going to fill all the comments in, and we're going to have a new version. Those will probably do like another 1 week short working group last call to deal with all the comments to get the new stuff paged back in. That'll be for both of those. But we know the authors are busy, so we're not pushing too hard. Next on the working group last call list, we're kind of thinking one of the things is the session signaling draft, which they've done a big update to. It's got a lot of changes. There's been a lot of, so I think we'll probably need some folks. We'll have to sit down and really do some, I was looking at the diffs, and most of it's just textual, but I think, it's going to take us we'll want to sort of go through that during working group last call. And the outer leaf draft, Mr. Crocker, I know is not here, but he has assured me that once he folds in the comments he's gotten from the application folks, he's going to resubmit it and get it back in the queue. And I think that one's ready as well. So he just said he was busy. Other things that we have adopted that we're probably not going to talk about today, the A name draft, which got a lot of good discussion in Chicago and even in Prague, I think. There are a few outstanding items. I think the big thing is the online signing, is the sort of DNSSEC issue. The TCP requirements draft, which people seem to like, we're going to have to sort of push that a little bit to see if we can get some comments. And we're going to talk to the author about maybe spinning a new version, but that may be pretty close as well. And serve stale, David has sort of folded in all the comments from all the folks. He's going to push out a new version if he hasn't already. It's done. Okay. See, and then just have folks sort of review, make sure that we sort of covered everything. So let me see. Yeah, on throughput, we've sort of slowed down a little. This year, in the last couple of years, we've put out 8 RFCs a year, which has been pretty good. This year, we've done 5. So we're kind of off our pace. We're not too alarmed by this because we definitely were dealing with a backlog initially. And we know that authors get busy, right? We all have jobs and we all sort of do stuff. And I take August off, and that's just the way it goes. So we'll probably, this is the time of year where we sort of get some more spun back up on stuff. So you'll probably see a lot more stuff getting pushed through. But if you think things aren't getting addressed, and I know I've talked to a few people about this, just talk to us, or we'll figure out what to move forward, sort of thing. So
yeah, the good thing about having a Monday meeting for the working group is we have the rest of the week for follow-up.
Yep.
So we're both here all week.
We're here all week.
Happy to meet with you offline.
Exactly. So, and of course, Paul's been keeping our document list up to date in terms of what we're working on, and he's keeping us on track. So current stuff for the current working group business we're going to talk about. Paul's got some good updates on terminology BIS, because I think we're really starting to get close to working group last call on that as well. Wes has got some final updates on the 5011. So we're getting much closer to him and Mike hugging this thing out. And then some updates on extended error. The local host guys aren't here, the HTTP people, but we're just going to sort of talk about it briefly. I think the big thing there is the DNSSEC issue. And Ray wants to talk about XPF briefly, but he has no slides, so it's okay. Some new stuff. Fujiwara's initial additional answers draft, which is kind of falls into the whole bin of there's a big pile of these multiple answer type things. And we're going to have to, I think that's going to be one of the big things we're going to have to sort of address which way we go. And I went back and I was looking at the 96 minutes in Berlin where we sort of talked about some of this stuff, and it seemed to be what we got out of the group was the group liked asking for stuff rather than the servers telling you stuff. That seemed to be the big consensus, right? They want the clients to ask rather than the servers to push. So just sort of, that seems to be sort of the guiding principle. DNSSEC validator requirements. Jeff's got a thing on the KSK role that looks interesting. Francis has the update for 2845, and I think that's something that we'll probably end up discussing as a candidate for adoption. They're all, in that pipeline. And Warren's got some little song and dance he wants to talk about. So I think what we'll do here is, now that we've covered all that stuff, it's time for Mr. Hoffman. And I can take notes for you while you're talking. Okay.
Everything in this room is bigger, including the big pink box.
Oh.
Slidage? Yep. Okay. So hi, I'm Paul Hoffman. I am presenting for both Andrew and Kazunori. Terminology BIS has been around for a while. Next slide. I have the power. Which, of course, the first thing I did was point at this screen because
That's what we do.
I guess I could do this, which would be just equally as dumb. So I think pretty much everyone here is familiar with the document. We're keeping it going. We're sort of hoping that at some point we can finish. We did the 07 draft in October. What has been happening in the last few drafts is we will get one or two people to say, oh, and I want you to add this, or can you change this one little thing? We do it, but we're not really hearing much from the working group. And so some of this may be, okay, we're all tired, let's finish it. And so what we want to do today is introduce some things to do one last push and then go to working group last call. What I would hate to see happen is we go to working group last call and all of a sudden a whole bunch of new issues come up that could have come up before now. So you'll see in the next couple of slides, we picked and choose some potential real issues, which maybe no one actually finds to be issues, but we're going to go for it anyways. And then the idea is that once we've talked about this a little bit, we will ask for working group last call and just then cut it off. For those of you who aren't familiar with RFC 7719, which this is a BIS of, we're starting to see more and more adoption of the definitions in 7719 in places outside the IETF as well. In the same way that probably everyone here has seen use of RFC 2119 language in completely weird places that have nothing to do with the IETF, we are starting to see some people picking out some of our things here, which is really a good thing. For 7719, we would like to get this one out so that they'll have something even better because, as you know, this is a fair expansion of 7719. So anyways, with that, here is a list, and you don't have to read it, but here's a list of all of the terms that have either been added or significantly expanded since we started the BIS work. There's a bunch of them, and it's easy to find them. This is a shorter list of things we would like folks to focus on today or in the next, say, 6 weeks before we go to working group last call. These are the ones that have changed, and I'll go through these on the next slide. But this is sort of, again, we're trying to get focus on the ones that we think people might actually say, oh yeah, you said this, but I want you to change it this way, and things like that. So global DNS, private DNS was the one that was added at the beginning of this year. One of the questions people have always been saying is, well, what is the DNS? What do you mean by the DNS? This was a way of trying to give focus to really when people say the DNS, which they really mean the global DNS. What is that? And for those people who didn't want to talk about global DNS, they were talking about a private DNS. And so the way we did this is we added a whole bunch of facets for what is a naming system, and then said, for the global DNS, this is what you fill in those facets. There was a lot of good discussion in January and February when we did it, because we sort of missed on a few things, but it really has stabilized since. We would love to see more discussion on this, because no one has bothered to really describe what is the DNS. Once this document is finished, we believe that this one or this pair of terms is going to be used in places way beyond the IETF. So let's get this right. In July, we talked about the in bailiwick and out of bailiwick stuff, and bailiwick confuses a whole lot of people. So the fact that we changed the description from 7719, anyone who has ever had to fight with bailiwick stuff, please read our current definitions and make sure that they're correct. In the last version of the document, people had asked us to revise the description of QName. And we had the discussion because QName is actually never really defined, and it's done by example and in 1035. And then later there were different examples and people had different reasons, so we want to make sure we got that right. The term recursive resolver, the way we had used it originally, we changed at the beginning of the year, and we hope that's right, because people do use that term a lot. Just a couple months or a year ago, we defined split DNS. Split DNS is a funny one, because many people would say there is no such thing as a split DNS. The DNS is, always one way or the other. And yet many people have products that use split DNS, the term split DNS for something or something else. So we want to make sure that we have that one right, because split DNS is something that customers get really confused about. So let's make sure that what we're saying, if they come to the terminology document, that come to say trust anchor, a topic I could start talking about again, but you don't want me to, because we postponed that topic. We added that at the beginning of the year. People still have some issues with trust anchor being, is it the key, is it not? So please look at that definition. And then validating resolver. The last one on the list we just added a few months ago. So these sets, this list and this list, if any of those tickled your fancy, like, oh yeah, I've been thinking about that, please spend time, look in the current draft, make sure we got it right. Editorial comments are, given that this is a document of definition, editorial comments are really, really appropriate. I mean, big picture comments are as well. Yeah, please go ahead.
No.
Oh,
finish your slides.
Okay, so I've got like 2 more slides. So one other thing, Tony Finch, when we were discussing RFC 7719, wanted us to add a couple of terms. We're about ready to do that as well. These are terms that are sort of have been danced around a lot, but so we're going to do that. And then here's my last slide. So what our intention is discussion today and such like that. We will put out a new draft really soon. There's no reason not to put out a draft in the middle of IETF week. We're going to start threads on these. I'm not sure exactly how we'll do that. I mean, I know how we'll start threads. I don't know if we're going to do them all at once or keep them separate, but I want to have everyone have an opportunity to at least do these. If we haven't started a thread on something you care about, start a thread or ask us to or whatever. This is sort of important. And then we will, once we think all of that has settled, we'll ask for a working group last call. So Alex.
So
Alex,
hold on
may I-
just a second. I have a real quick question. Given the way the document is structured, I can see how it would be intimidating to try to review the whole thing, but it also seems as if review on a specific set of terms is also helpful for you.
Yep.
So you don't even have to be comfortable reviewing the entire document to be able to provide useful input.
Right.
The other thing is that if 7719 is anything to go by, this document will be cited by lots of people doing lots of things with DNS outside of the IETF. So getting it right is going to be important and useful.
Right. So one thing on what Suzanne just said is if you're intimidated by looking through the whole document, many people here have assistants or colleagues or bosses who think they know a little bit about the DNS, but should know more. Any of those people really could read the entire document with a red pen in their hand. So even on one saying, I have no idea what this is, that's fine. There's lots of things in DNS they'll never understand. But if they understand half of a definition and not the second half, that's valuable information for us. So feel free to use to flog the document now on people who you wish understood some of these terms and see whether they get it as well. So please.
Alex Mervonik to IT. Two things. One thing, I'm volunteering to review the whole document.
Thank you.
And I'm trying to figure whether I get a colleague to do that as well. And the second one, something that I've heard as a term a couple of times, and it confuses a lot of people, is local anycast. So
Is
local anycast.
God, I've never heard that, and it's confusing me already. So it's only
Yeah.
Monday morning.
Anyways, it's maybe it's like a local thing.
Okay, so send that to the list. Let's see
Yeah.
if there is any interest in that. Yeah.
Cool.
Stefan Botsmeyer, AFNIC. I have a small
Actually, one
disagreement.
question. Can people hear Stefan?
Okay,
Okay, because I couldn't either, and that was okay. No, and the mic's on, but it's on too low to
Okay,
understand.
Stefan
that's better.
Botsmeyer,
Thank
AFNIC. Is it better?
Yes.
I have a small disagreement with the way you presented the QNAME issue, because there was a poor definition of QNAME in the original RFC. The problem is that it was changed later by RFC 2308, and the discrepancy between the two was noticed only long time after. So now we have to decide whether we roll back to the original definition, which was more or less what RFC 7719 did, or if we try to acknowledge that we have two competing definitions and we try to explain that there is this and that. So basically for QNAME, that's the choices between these two possibilities.
Right.
Because the definition in RFC 2308 is really different from the original one.
Right. And what the discussion on the list came up with is that not many people are actually using the new definition that much. They really are using the original. So do we say, oh, there's a new one and try to get everyone to use it, or do we actually define it the way that most people are using it and acknowledge that some people are using this new one as well? So let's try to get the words right on that, because this isn't the only one that we have where there's a situation like that, where there was a definition, there was a refinement, but people didn't, really use the refinement. We can't reject it. We really should talk about it, but we should be honest to the reader that if you're reading something and it looks like this, understand that many people still think about it this way. Yeah. Great. Thank you. Other thoughts?
We should have a raffle, adopt a term.
Absolutely.
Win valuable prizes.
Hello, Paul. This is Bill Manning.
Mhm.
The comment that I will make here is that terminology, like language, is not static. And so as you try and pour concrete over this, it's going to slip out from underneath you, and people will come up with new terms and new definitions as things go. And people are going to point back, and you're going to start. You will not start. You will continue the ongoing wars of what does this really mean? Because for different people, they will change the terminology without referring to this RFC to be or this draft. It will change. So just,
Okay.
it's not static.
Right.
Never
Right.
was, never will be.
Co-author.
My name is Andrew Sullivan. I'm one of the other Stuckies for this. And in response to Bill, I don't think anybody thinks we're pouring concrete here, right? But I mean, what you just described, Bill, is the problem of writing dictionaries. And the fact is that we've got lots of dictionaries despite the fact that the language evolved. So I don't think there's anything different here. I think this is therefore a useful thing to do, even if it does change afterwards. And I can't tell whether you're disagreeing with that or not.
Yeah. So, and again, we already have 7719 and we're working from that. We haven't had anyone say to us, you shouldn't have done 7719 because you're, concretizing anything. One of the things that we want to emphasize, and if as you're going through either these highlights or just picking a term, when we quote from original documents, we always point to them so that a reader might actually go back and see more than the 2 sentences or whatever that we're doing. Hopefully that's good enough. So,
And I remember this one is standards track.
absolutely.
Yeah, the last
Absolutely.
one, 7719 was informational. This one is actually trying to adjust things.
I think you're right. I'm sorry, I didn't remember. Yeah. Okay.
So I just want, people should remember that sort of thing.
Right.
Also, you put January 15th, which I think is a very good day, sort of a very good time frame to basically kick off a working group last call.
Yep. So
Yep.
that's our goal. We're happy to delay it due to too much activity on the mailing list.
Yeah.
So,
That would be an excellent
right.
problem.
And again, that would be a working group last call, which could take a while. But at this point, so we will start threads on this. My guess is I'm just going to pull a number out of my head. 2 threads a week or 3 threads a week of things like that. But if this talk has inspired you at all to be going and looking, go ahead and start without us. Right. Thank you.
Well,
Okay. Thanks, Paul.
All right, it's back. I'm sorry. So this is 5011 Security Considerations, authored by myself and Warren. I'm Wes Hardiker, the first one. Next, oops, you gave me the thing, then I forgot about it.
And
So a
be
couple of
careful-
things.
Hold on a second. Just be careful of not turning away from the mic.
Not turning away from the mic. I will stand here
Yeah, much easier to
rigidly
hear
in
you.
the pink box. So we went through working group last call from a 4-week last call, and we'll get to sort of the results of that as we go along. There was a bunch of comments from a few people. So there wasn't a huge amount of review during that time, which is going to be a problem we'll talk about in a minute. A couple of quick things. Ed Lewis provided 4 strong comments, one of which was that he doesn't actually think the document should be published because the audience of the document, namely the operators of ICANN, have not participated in the review of the document. Not really sure what I can do about this one because I've had a lot of discussions with ICANN staff, and I know they're at least aware of the document. Whether they have the ability to review it or not, that's a different sort of subject that I can't fix, right? They know it exists and they can review. Trust anchor usage is incorrect. I agree with him absolutely. It was incorrect. I went through and looked at every instance of the word trust anchor and made sure that it was used and changed some terminology. So it's no longer a trust anchor publisher, for example. It's a PEP publisher, which is, I always forget what PEP means. It's the standard terminology. It's the bit in the DNSSEC key. The document begins to commingle validation with trust anchor management. He was absolutely right about that too. I cleaned up that terminology really well and went through and looked for every word of the word validation and made sure that they applied correctly. And my response back to him, which I haven't actually sent to the list yet, will be, please tell me if I got it wrong. And then finally, not worth our time. One of the things about this document is that there's sort of a low return on investment, as he said, because it's a very narrow scope. And so one of the questions that we'll come up to in a minute is, is this important? It's hard math. It's not exactly easy to fully understand, isn't it? Did I lose the mic? Uh-oh. There, it's back. Hello.
It seems to be very directional.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, I didn't move that much. I think it clipped out. Maybe the battery's dying. Anyway, so his question is it worth our time considering it's a very small, target? And our view, it is worth the time because it's clarifying an important detail of the specification that people don't want to get wrong. There was a comment from Paul Hoffman on, he thought it actually looked good, and we may or may not want to add another section clarifying whether we do math based on a timer kind of approach or a wall clock based approach. The current document, not yet published because I didn't make the cutoff, actually has both in it. So I think that that's sort of the right consensus to come forward that hopefully will make anybody that wanted to be on both sides of the equation outcome. And then finally, there is comments from Mike St. John's. timing one, when is it safe to revoke the oldest trust anchor keys? And sort of there's a timing question of, do you measure it from now as if I'm trying to do a sleep until that right time, or do you measure it from, or do you define it as a wall clock? In other words, at this date and this time. So now the current document, not yet published, contains both. And then the other big question, and this is one of the questions I have for you today. We don't have a lot of time, so I'm only asking really two high-level questions. One of which, the second one, is there is this notion of network delays and retries and failures cause, the time period that you must wait to be longer. And so the question is, the math gets, of course, more fuzzy when you add in this, flexible time. And there's the current document, has a 2 times an hour type thing plus a little bit. That'll be later. Mike St. John's suggested a much more complex thing based on the retry interval from 5011, which ends up being, and did I lose it again? Come on, hello? No, it's not, it has nothing to do with that. I haven't moved, it's the mic dying. So now I can, nope, that one's not working either. We lost all audio entirely. Oh, there we go. Yeah, that's not good. So somebody might want to notify the audiovisual crew because something's definitely broken. Anyway, so Mike St. John's has a fairly complex, even more complex bit of math to base it on, base the safety factor on the retry interval from 5011 and do so many retry intervals depending on, how many resolvers are out in the world, and whole log n kind of approach. I won't go into the math, but it actually made sense. I understand why he picked it. The end result is the safety factor could go up to something like 28 days in the minimum case if you went with that approach. So really quickly, one of the things I've done is I restructured the document. So this is the old version, and all of the timing is in there, and there's all this math. And so to talk about the piece where I broke down the document into the math terms are now at the top, and then there are different sections for the wall timer. The wall timer, I can do this really. The wall timer based calculation and the wall clock based calculation, excuse me, the wait timer and the wall clock. So hopefully this solves a lot of the issues of how you calculate timers. And then when I publish it, which will be later this week, review and let me know, did this solve those kind of issues with disagreements about how the math should be written. So I did it both ways. So here's the real question in my mind. Big question number one, should this be published at all? So during last call, so it was adopted by, with fairly good consensus at one point. As time has gone on, the math looks ugly, right? It actually got worse as we realized that there was more problems than we originally thought. There's more terms that had to go into the math. And so during last call, Paul Hoffman said, yes. Mike St. John's gave a lot of comments and even made at one point, a suggestion that this brought some new concepts into his eyes that he hadn't thought of before, but didn't actually say what his opinion was, and that's just fine. You don't have to have an opinion. Ed Lewis is very much against it. He thought it was actually authored by the wrong people, was sort of one of his consensus points. And then, of course, the authors and I agree that it should be published. Warren and I think it should be published. We need more opinions is this a useful thing to get forward and go through, RFC editor time and that kind of stuff. So right now, we don't have a whole lot of opinions on that. So I'd love opinions now.
George Michelson, APNIC. I think this is a useful slide to leave up while we have a conversation because it's a talking point that I think should not be just brushed away.
This was the stopping point, yes.
So I have sympathy with some of where Ed is coming from, but there is a moment in my heart where I'm thinking, if you've got a document adopted in a working group, the hands on the pen are much less important than the voices speaking or writing words for submission. I can't take seriously a complaint that the wrong hands had editorialship. I can't. He has to be saying, I wanted different words for that to have substance. And then we're back in the conversation. Well, what's the substantive difference? So it feels like if he's really saying no, it's not about the hands on the pen, it's about the nature of the materials in the document. That's got to be the matter of substance, or this is just a ludicrous observation.
All right, thanks very much for the...
So I have a second one.
Please.
Anything in internet process technology that's about the cluster of things that are talking to some central agents frequently, measured in thousands of events per second, that then has complex mathematics defining timing boundaries that are measured in days. multiples of 86400 seconds multiplied by double digits. I struggle with the complexity of the maths you need to set a number there. Frankly, pick one and see is as good as a complex mathematical formula. If these agents are talking to each other at sub-second rates and it's days, why do we need complex maths?
So before you walk away, because I want to clarify that, right, which was that it was written as defining the minimum point. So it's not a recommendation. It's written as a lot of people were getting this wrong when they were talking about it, and they were actually picking time less than the minimum. So that's why it's not written as a recommendation. The recommendation, and Mike St. John's can talk to it in a minute, is you should have multiple keys and you should be doing it for 9 months and longer. This is talking about what's the unsafe value.
Okay, but adding complexity to the mathematics behind it. I mean, I see logarithms and I fall off my chair.
Well, so we'll get to the retry one in a minute, maybe, if we have time. Hale?
I'm a little concerned for his chair stability. I also very much think that we need this, that it should be advanced. We have a lot of very recent operational experience of the things that can go wrong with people that thought they were doing 5011 right. And so it's surprising to me that this is even a question that we wouldn't be seeking greater clarity in it. And I also have to concur. I mean, I love you, Ed. I don't know if you're here or not, but I can only hope that that's kind of misrepresents your position in saying that these are the wrong people doing it, because we really should be focused on the words that need to be said. So
Ed and I have a long history and we have good respect for each other, but those really were the first words in his paragraph. I'm not making that up. It really was what he said.
So mostly though, yeah, don't hold back. It's got to go forward.
Okay. Thank you for your opinion. Joe?
Joe Abley. So I also think this should be published, because I think, even though, as it turns out, we probably only really care in the grand scheme of things about 5011 with one zone in the entire DNS, we also know it's kind of a pain in the ass when you can't tell what people are doing or implementations might behave differently. So I think it's important to specify. I assume you have other big questions on subsequent slides.
Only one more, actually. So there's little things that don't need to be talked about today. There's really not enough time. But the other big one is the safety margin and whether it should be included or not.
I have a non-numbered big question comment, which is that you took something that is complicated, and in response to Mike's and John's comments, you now have kind of made it more complicated by duplicating it in two different senses, two different visualizations, one wall clock, one intervals. That to me is worse than choosing one of them, because now you have two different things that there are bound to be corner cases where they disagree, and then you can't tell which is normative. I think it's better to have one. And to be honest, I haven't heard a lot of people stand up and say that they think intervals is better.
What's better? I'm sorry.
That intervals are better than wall time. Okay. And my sense is that wall time is actually operationally what you care about. So I suspect that one is better than two, and if I had to be asked which is better, I think probably wall time.
Okay, fair enough. We did ask that question in Chicago, and there was a minor lean toward interval at that time, and part of it was that it was based on the other RFC that I keep forgetting with the other set of equations, and that one's based on interval too. So, but anyway, David?
It scares me, I'm going to say this, but channeling Ed, I suspect his main concern was he believes that operators should have more input on this as opposed to DNS protocol geeks. I believe it should be published, despite the fact that Ed works for somebody who works for me. But I think it would be helpful if more folks who are directly involved in the operations of this would actually be able to weigh in and say, Ed, you ignorance letter, something along those lines. I class myself as someone who prefers the interval as opposed to wall clock, just because I like making things difficult.
All right, thanks, David. And I would actually hope that after the KSK gets finally rolled, that maybe your organization in collaboration with others can produce a BCP around this, because I think there's a lot of lessons learned in the last couple of years. Mike?
Yeah. So I actually believe this should be published at some point along the way. I just wanted to get it right. The root did two things that I didn't contemplate when I wrote 5011, and one of them was the single trust anchor steady state. And the second one was something that came up as we were going through this last iteration of early signatures of things that might actually make it into the wild. Turns out looking at the document, looking at -7, which is up there, that's actually, when you fix the language and signature expiration time, you got the interval wrong because it's latest expiration minus now, which then gets back in again to actually figure out what the date is in which you can publish.
I think I've cleaned that up in the most recent one, but I do want your opinion. So because the most
Yeah.
recent one, you know, actually.
We'll see what happens when
yeah.
it goes there.
Yeah, no, so I agree. It needs to be right, absolutely.
So if I'll stick around for the next slide if you want, or
We're going to be out of time, so we won't go to the next one. So we'll do the next one on the list.
oh, okay. Well, I can explain what was going on there. Part of it was that we were picking a number that didn't make sense for a subscriber base of 5 hosts, but and made no sense for a subscriber base of 20, 30 million. And trying to figure out how to scale that was why you put the log in. No.
Yeah, no, I the math made sense to me. The tricky part for me is whether we should include some sort of factor or not, and you know whether you deal with network delays and retries or not. I've heard opinions on both sides. I honestly don't care. I just want to do what the community wants, and I've heard both sides. So consensus has been hard so far. Eric.
Eric Oswald-Versen. I just want to sort of really quickly pile on. I think this is really good to publish. I think if nothing else, documenting what people's ideas and perspectives are on different rolling timers and semantics, just as a publication, is really useful. You know, like looking back at like all the key rollers that have happened, it's nice to be able to say, oh, this guy must have been thinking this way, that girl must have been thinking that way. So I think this is really useful, regardless of whether there winds up being a recommendation to just document different perspectives about why people do things.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, from a historical perspective, I like publishing stuff so that people making new work based on 5011, you know, has sort of the math behind it. So the last question, I'm going to say that we can go to the list. If everybody could open their mail readers and just write to the list as to whether you think there should be a safety margin factor or not. There's not exactly a clear understanding of whether people want that or not. So you don't have to look at the math. You don't have to look at anything else. Just should there be, you know, some sort of fudge factor like 2 times TTL is what's been written in other documents, or not. So, all right, with that, we'll go on to presentation number 2.
Somebody was talking about need more operator input sort of thing, and I know a few of you people on our RSAC, so I'm wondering if those root operators actually could sort of weigh in on that as well, right?
So speaking with my root operator hat on, we publish the data from IANA, and to a large extent, because of that, we don't necessarily concern ourselves with the timing associated with what ICANN actually and IANA work together. So they may have opinions, but it doesn't actually hit them over the head as much as you might think.
Okay.
I think all right, so either both mics go out at once or neither. All right, so next up is extended errors. And so we brought this up, it got approved after, I think after Chicago, or no, after Prague as a working group document. This one should be a quick one to push to the group. There's not a whole lot to put in it, other than possibly a list of errors, you know, that we could publish about. But the reality is that IANA can handle that fine, and it doesn't necessarily need to be in the initial document as we go forward. I did not even try and alphabetize those names, so that's actually a random order of names. It bubbled in my head as a random sort, so just ignore the ordering there. So we sent a question to the working group a while back about one of the things we heard back during the call for adoption is people wanted ranges of error codes, kind of like HTTP, like everybody knows, you know, 404 and that leading number in HTTP indicates the different type of error. So we took that and thought about it, but the thing is that DNS adds a little bit of complexity to it because we already have a return code type, or the R code actually already gives some sort of error. And then, so the question is, do we align the secondary error code with the R code or not, and things like that. So here are 4 options that we spelled out, and we got no feedback on the mailing list. So first question to you today is, what do you think? So the choices are basically, we could do individual codes per the existing draft. In other words, sequential, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, based on, you know, codes that we come up with. Number 2 in the draft was existingly defined as DNSSEC bogus. And then to support error code ranges, like we heard feedback, we had 3 options, and this is where either you give us feedback or we'll pick one. How's that? One is a 32-bit code field with integer ranges, you know, where by integer, I mean those people with 10 fingers on their hand and count with base 10, which is sort of normal in our society, where we have NNYY, where NN is possibly the R code, but note that the R code can be longer than 100, so we will run into issues there. And then YY as a subcode. So the example there is 0201, which looks very HTTP code-like, ends up being, you know, C9 in hex, but that would indicate serve fail and DNSSEC bogus, where 02 is the serve fail code and 01 is the subcode for DNSSEC bogus within the serve fail set of codes. These get kind of ugly. So, you know, it was a great suggestion going forward, and then when we actually tried to put it in implementation, it looked a little bit more messy. So 32-bit code field number 3 is the other option, where there's where we copy the 16-bit R code into the eDNS0 spot and then add another 16-bit subcode, so that, for example, 0002, which is again serve fail, straight copy, and 0001 becomes DNSSEC bogus, and you combine those together and you get some very long integer, but the hex looks clean. And then finally is a 16-bit code, which is basically the same thing as what I just talked about, but you leave the R code where it is, and the error code has to be a subtable from the R code. So, you know, R code would still be 002, and the error code would be 0001 serve fail DNSSEC bogus, but only when the R code is 002. So you can see that that great suggestion turned into like a mess of options. And so this is my question to you. What do you want to do about, you know, this set of choices? And does anybody, you know, or maybe more people think that we should go back to sequential, because it gets really messy when you start thinking about R codes?
Paul Hoffman wearing my HTTP hat. The whole idea of the first number means something and the subs underneath failed miserably over and over. People got it wrong. People would spend months arguing whether this new error was supposed to be under 400 or 500, stuff like that. Just ignore that. It was a cute idea, and I would say that at least 3/4 of HTTP people would say it's been a harmful waste of time. People look just at the numbers. So to me, that would go towards 4.
That is excellent feedback from that group. So lessons learned is always a good thing. Thanks, Paul.
Stefan Bortsmeyer, AFNIC. Did someone try to see for all the possible error code if they were specific to a given R code or not? Today in the draft, there are things like this extended error code should be used only with serve fail, but is it really a case where you can have an extended error code that has a meaning for different possible errors? I don't think so. And then it's not necessary to put the R code in the extended error code.
Well, so there are certainly some errors that cross multiple R codes. I don't know whether serve fail is one, for example, but and so yeah, you're going to run into issues where there's a collision, as Paul was just saying, where, you know, some errors might need to be in both. So maybe you reserve 002 for, you know, for both serve fail and for other stuff. But so I know we haven't done a huge amount of work in that area. So the document is still very short on the number of errors that we define, and that's the other feedback I need from the group, is what else is missing in terms of informational guidance to the receiver.
Joe Abley. I just thought I'd point out, I think 1, 2, and 3 here all require very careful specification of what you do when you screw up the R code in the header and the R code that's either explicitly or implicitly embedded in the extended error code, which is a whole can of worms that you'd be really nice to avoid. So the only one here to me that makes any sense is 4.
Fair enough. Note that 1 doesn't depend on R codes either. So,
well, it kind of does. If the R code is no error, but then you have an extended R code that says the DNSSEC is bogus, what does that mean? You have to define every combination of R code and extended error codes that make no sense for that R code and work out what those mean and what the handling should be. You can avoid all of that if you just don't do it.
Well, don't all of the options run into that issue, right? Because if...
Well, except 4 doesn't.
I guess 4, true, but you can... No, that's a good point. That's weird. You're right.
I think I'm also struggling to see the difference between 1 and 2, but I mean, just having my old school head on, adding or copying information that we already have in the packet doesn't make much sense to me. So, I mean, 1 and 4, I mean, are roughly the same, but you have to be very careful in specification.
Okay, thank you.
Alex Mayhofer. Another option that doesn't necessarily make it much less complicated would be that we allow in the registry of extended error codes a list of R codes with which that extended error code can be used. Yeah, which opens up a whole can of worms if we ever.
Could you repeat the last half of that sentence? I'm sorry, it's very echoey up here, and it's hard to hear everybody perfectly.
My suggestion is we could think about adding to the IANA registry where we have the extended R codes. To add a list of allowed R codes with which that extended error can be used, which in turn means that we would probably change that list as soon as we introduce a new R code each time. But it's sort of like a little bit between, can I use this with that, and avoid combinations that don't make much sense. Yeah, it's a little bit of the middle between three and completely independent extended R codes.
Right. Yeah. So you're basically proposing a list of R codes or a list of error codes combined with what R codes are usable under. And if you get something that doesn't match that combination, which was just brought up a second ago, then that's a different error, right? Then there's an error, a meta error. Yeah. All right. So again, this post is still on the list. If you want to go back and respond to it directly, the authors would definitely appreciate more feedback. How am I on time?
And number 4 means a sub-registry for all the current ones, correct?
Yeah, it would be a lookup table. So the R code would be the first item in a lookup table, and the second 16 bits would be the second item in a lookup table. How are we on time?
Good.
Okay. So there's basically 3 other questions that we had. These actually haven't gone to the list because we were waiting for responses to the last question that we never got. But basically a couple of things. One, can we include more than one error code or information code, as we might want to call it? And was there any reason to prevent this? I mean, the protocol would support it, and there doesn't seem to be a reason that we have in our mind as why this would be necessarily a bad thing to do. But if you have a bad thing to do, why it would be bad to include more than one informational sub packet, speak up, please. And the other question is, what should a forwarding server do? And this is a little more tricky. So in a forwarding service, they really, if they go off and do this request for you and they get back an EDS0 extended error packet, should they always send it, never send it, or send it only if it believes the client can handle it? And how you make that determination would be up to code, of course. And then finally, security. Errors are unauthenticated. There's been some people that have talked about, well, but you're getting back a section of a packet which isn't signed by anything, so it's fudgeable. Because they're unauthenticated, should this document even exist? Because we have no way to secure it. Is there anything we can do? And then there's been some notion of, well, but they're just informational in the first place. It's more likely that it would just end up in a user-defined, message somewhere or something like that. So we don't have really good answers for any 3 of these. We would be happy to make stuff up because we're good at that. But we'd prefer to have your opinion so that we could make stuff up, and then you can yell at us later if we get it wrong.
Stefan Bartmeyer, Aflik. For the security thing, yes, there is an obvious thing we can do, is to use DNS over TLS, because typically it will be used for stub to resolver. We have a standard for DNS over TLS. Now we have even a standard to authenticate the resolver. It has been approved 1 hour ago. So it seems to me the obvious solution for this 3A problem.
That's true, although the deprive DNS over TLS solution was really resolver to recursive, and that doesn't deal with things like forwarders and things like that so well, or to authoritatives for that matter. So.
Correct, but it's better than nothing.
Yeah, but it's coming. I think you're right. So Eric, I think that's you all the way in the back there.
Yeah. Hey, sorry, I messed up the queue. This is Eric Fairstein. Yeah, so I was going to say something similar to what you said, and I hate to disagree with Stefan, but I think the security concern is something I was going to jump up and say something about. And in general, I think it's probably okay as long as you define these codes, you think about what's sort of advisory and what would actually prompt, a security action. In other words, if I get this code and it's going to cause me to retransmit or make a decision, whatever, then yeah, the lack of authentication is a big deal. If it's something that's, evidence that just, gives me an indication, just think that through as you define the codes. I think some of the codes might be more, reasonable than others, but to just disagree with the TLS thing, That's transport security, and this is about like a sort of an object. So they're probably composable, but I'd say that they're kind of different. So I wouldn't try to use transport security to secure an object like a datagram that comes back that has its own lifetime and caches and whatnot after that. So that's just my 2 cents.
No, very good thought. Thank you, Eric. Robert?
Yeah, Robert Story, ISI. I was actually thinking about this on the previous slide, and you keep talking about an error code. What if it was error flags? If you've got a 16-bit ID or a 32-bit ID split in half, you could have so many flags that would let you have multiple error codes.
Well, so the reason that we don't have flags, because we thought about that for a while, but the reality is we expected to find more than 16, so the number of flags gets very long. And we could do things like the weird NSEC flagging, where you skip large sections of zeros and stuff. But the question is which is better, more flags, or when you mainly define 1 or 2, or more error EDNS 0 blocks, which take up even more bits. So that's a good point. Joe?
I'm Joe Abley. I'm confused about what Eric said, so I think I may be disagreeing with him, but possibly I just don't understand what he said, and I should buy him a beer. But it seems to me
wait. Could you repeat all that and a little slowly and more loudly?
Okay.
The echo is driving me nuts.
It seems to me that what we're talking about is exactly transport and not objects by definition. Objects are things in the data model which are signed at the place that they're generated before they're published. We're talking about codes that correspond to the movement of those objects between servers, which I think is all transport. So I don't understand Eric's comment that this is about object security and not transport security.
Well, so that's a really good question. But my return question is: are we only defining stuff that are transport error specific? Imagine an authoritative server that has an error to return. I don't know what it might be, so we'll we won't name it. That has to return it to the resolver, which is actually supposed to go back to the client, and then it becomes an object that is passed from top to bottom.
I guess. I mean,
this sounds like you need to continue on the
well,
mailing
just
list.
one really brief sort of further exploration. The R code that seems like it corresponds to the data model is the name error, because an object either contains a name or it doesn't. But that's why we have an NSEC record, which is signed. So you don't rely on the transport security. You do have object security in that case. All of the rest of them, I think, are exactly transport.
No, that's a good point. So I mean, I like the thought behind that's going to make me think longer. Thank you. Eric, last comment, and then we're going to close the mic.
Yeah, I just want to say that I'd be happy to take that up with Joe, but I'll take the beer option, so I'll save the microphone.
Okay, thanks, Eric. All right, that's it for me. Next.
Thank you. Go ahead while I'm sorting this out. Okay.
Yeah, there is also another open question in the draft that we didn't discuss, the possibility of using extended error code with non-error, such as no error. You say in the draft that you think it's a bad idea, but there is no detail. Why is it a bad idea?
Yeah, so informational kind of errors or warnings or suggestions or by the ways, I actually think they should be in there. So that's a good question. So we'll go back and revisit that. And Warren's nodding his head, so he must agree with me.
Okay. All right. Since the HTTP people bailed out on us, they wanted just to sort of talk about localhost for a minute. I think the one outstanding item in going through all this stuff on the mailing list is the DNSSEC thing. So, and if someone thinks there's other stuff out there, and please correct me, sort of thing. So we just wanted to know if people had any opinions on how they want to address it in the draft, if the draft is wrong. The HTTP people, I think, don't really know the DNSSEC stuff that well, so I think they'll need some of our guidance on that.
It's worth keeping in mind that if people feel very strongly that this name needs to be signed, that means going back into the swamp of whether to ask for a delegation in the root. So we would want very, very clear guidance as the chairs to forward a document that suggested that should be done. And I see our AD at the microphone.
Yeah, but no AD hub. So
okay.
So I think
Warren, just a guy.
Yep. Badge says nobody. I think I was one of the people who was originally saying that I think that this needed special DNSSEC handling, and that came from a bunch of previous discussions on similar things. looking further at what I think the correct behavior of this is, and I did summarize that in an email, I think that the current response from the root, which is NX domain, correctly reflects what the semantics of this should be. So basically, the whole section of the text that I had suggested they put in and kind of wrote and was like, here, stick this in, that sounds good, should probably all just be scrubbed out. And, you know, the DNS does the right thing anyway. Okay, thanks, bye.
Okay.
Wes Hardiker agreeing with Warren in a different way. In the IETF, we keep having this belief that the DNS is the only naming system, and it's like, you know, if you get a NX domain or you get a serve fail because it's DNSSEC, you know, failing, that it doesn't exist. And the reality is, we know that that's not true. There's a huge chunk of enterprises that have name trees that don't exist outside, and if you ask the external, you know, DNS service for it, they're going to give you back an NX domain or an error because it doesn't exist. The reality is that we have been dealing with multiple naming systems since the dawn of time, with NS Switch and a whole bunch of other, you know, things, including YP, you know, or whatever the name of that service was. We know how to deal with that on the end host. And so, you know, maybe localhost should always be 127.0.0.1. And if so, if we think that that's true, and : 1, then we can publish it and sign it. But the reality is, if the value might change on every system, then you can't sign it. It just doesn't make sense. And even if you signed a delegation to nothing. So no, this is outside the DNS in my mind. That doesn't make it wrong. It just means that this is not the right place to get the answer for it, and you should fall back to one of your other mechanisms.
So I agree that localhost should refer the loopback interface, but there's a gallimaufry amount of situations where it is not 127.0.0.1. For example, with FreeBSD jails, you share the loopback interface, but each individual jail has to have a different loopback number. So,
yeah.
So yeah, Warren Kumari again, I think sort of exactly agreeing with that. It's an error to look this up in the DNS. And so therefore, you know, if you do that, the correct thing from the DNS is, you're asking me something that doesn't make sense. I don't have that name.
It's good feedback to have, and we'll take that back. And Ray Bellis on the XPF draft.
Got no slides.
Yeah, didn't need any slides for this one because it's going to be very brief, and it's a very small draft as well. So we talked about this briefly in Prague, and possibly the meeting. Talked about this briefly in Prague, and possibly the meeting before. Anybody not familiar with XPF and what I'm proposing to do? Okay, no, I'm going to assume you've all read the draft then. The changes in the last update to the draft. Now, we had a lot of feedback in the last meeting about the privacy aspects. We're still potentially looking for some text on that from the people that are really strong on the privacy, but we have in the new version of the draft added new text that specifically bans stub resolvers, recursive resolvers, and any client-side middle boxes from transmitting an XPF RR inside a packet. Obviously, we can't actually stop anybody, but at least the draft makes it clear that this is not intended. There's now a presentation format defined for the RR. Initially, I'd said in the draft that because this is a meta RR, that there was actually no need for presentation format. Then it was pointed out that actually if you're debugging packets, it'd still be useful to be able to display one. So that's now defined in the draft. I've updated the TSIG text so that you can, so it's clearer now whereabouts the XPF record is supposed to be added to the packet, and typically that should be after any TSIG record that appears. So the TSIG is not actually calculated over the RRSIG, sorry, over the TSIG, sorry. The TSIG record is not calculated over the XPF record, because the XPF record is tagged on the end, then is stripped off by the server before handling any TSIG calculations to actually verify the packet. Again, we feel this is adequate because the record is only supposed to be communicated between two trusted systems that are on the same network. So we thought the security aspects of that are okay. Those are really the changes. So it's a very, very short draft, and I'd like to get even more feedback and hopefully get to a point where we can actually call for adoption and get this progressed. There is already implementation out there. in DNS dist, at least on the proxy side of that. And I'm not sure, the PowerDNS guys aren't here, whether they've also implemented that on the server side of PowerDNS. But we want to get to the point where we can get a code point and get the draft adopted.
So how many people have read the draft? That's pretty good. I think it would be good to have a couple of, one or two people to review and
Yeah.
make sure you want to ask the working, you have a clear path forward for the working group to adopt it. So do we have one or two volunteers to work with Ray on reviewing this and making sure that
Maybe put some hands up now if you're willing to review this, please.
reviewers?
No, Sarah in particular is not here. Ironically, Sarah raised most objections on the privacy side of things in the last working group meeting.
I saw Joe Abley with a hand
Yeah, I
up.
saw Joe. Sarah actually came up after and said, yeah, we actually need this for doing TLS proxying. Ironically, we actually do need to, yeah.
More
this
armors
is solving
will
a
be
real
twisted.
problem, despite the privacy aspects. So I saw Joe. Did you see somebody else? Any other volunteers, please, for reviewing?
There is the rest of the week for
Yeah, I'll do some circulating.
people to solicit bribes of beer.
And I'd say, barring any sort of large negative feedback, we would probably kick off a call for adoption sometime in December and just see where things go, right? And the chairs aren't against that unless there's some violent outbursts here in the room about that. So as I watch Mr.
Yeah,
Houston.
the draft is certainly not complete, but it's a long way progressed.
Yeah.
And as far as I can see, no reason not to adopt. And if the privacy aspects become too great, then we drop
can
it
just dump
or
it.
we
Yep.
fix them.
Okay, that's kind of what we were thinking of too. So, okay, you'll get some feedback. We'll sync up with the two reviewers and plan on something in December probably.
Lovely. Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Oh, you took the little clicky thing, Ray. Oh, you didn't. Oh, there it is. Oh, there you go.
Hello, I'm Kazunori Fujiwara from JPRS. I submitted draft Fujiwara DNS additional answers 00, returning additional answers in DNS responses. It's similar to multiple response draft. So first, I will explain differences from multiple response draft. My draft proposes authoritative name server software developers choose additional records without configuration or system-wide configuration, like minimum responses. And authoritative name server software developers choose additional records like MX or SRV responses on Binary or NSD. They add mail exchange A quad A in additional section. They already implemented. And I propose.
I think you need to be closer to the microphone.
Okay.
I don't think it's picking you up.
Okay. And I propose aggressive appending NSEC3 resource records to generate no data NX domain responses by RFC 8198. And there are common backgrounds. DNS standards allow for supplementary information to be included in the additional section of the DNS response. Existing implementation already add MX mail exchange or SRV target, and developers knows well. And the DNSSEC guarantees that these additional records will be accepted or cached by RFC 2181 section 5.4.1 ranking data. And validating resolvers can synthesize no data NX domain responses using cached NSEC or NSEC3 records by RC 8198. So this is my proposal of additional answers. Authoritative name server software developers choose query, answer, and additional records pairs. And the draft proposed good pairs. And to increase the probability that these extra records, extra data will actually be useful for resolvers, the query has DNSSEC OK bit set, and additional records are signed by DNSSEC. Additional records may contain NSEC, NSEC3 URLs for the query and other related names. Responses with additional records fit in required response size. And these are good additional answer pairs. For name a query, additional answers may be name quad A or name NSEC, NSEC3. For name quad A query, additional answers may be name A or name NSEC, NSEC3. For name MX query, additional answers may exchange A quad A and NSEC, NSEC3. This is already implemented. For name SRV query, target additional answers may be target host A quad A NSEC, NSEC3. And for name quad A query, additional answers may be _443 _TCP name TLSA or NSEC, NSEC3. And for _443 _TCP name TLSA query, additional answers may be name A quad A NSEC. TLSA MX SRV pairs have different names. And I implemented A and quad A pairs. And I implemented in NSD, and for one pair case, I added 8 lines, and NSD answered, NSD added for query, for name A query, NSD added quad A records in additional section or NSEC source record. And I summarized existing multiple response proposals. Quad A for free proposal, quad A for free proposed additional quad A in answer section. It changed DNS standards, I think, and multiple responses proposed should RR controls additional RRs. And additional answers proposed developers choose additional RRs and adding NSEC or NSEC3 source records. And the multi-queue types draft proposes new EGN0 option that carries additional queue types. And accompanying questions draft proposes new EGN0 option that carries additional queue names, queue types, R codes. And I made a comparison chart.
This is a fantastic chart, actually. As long as people all agree with their proposal sort of thing. Oh, some people are going to argue with us now.
No, this is exactly what we want to be looking at, because we have multiple proposals in this space. It seems to be something people are very interested in, but the chart sort of presents why it's been hard to figure out what we want to do. So,
congratulations.
And I see a line at the microphone.
Good line.
Life is good.
Wes Hardiker, so I'm one of the authors of the multiple responses draft too, and I think that in my mind, there are 3 places where multiple answers may come from, right? One is the client asks additional questions, so there's some of those fit that. The multiple responses draft has been talking about, well, what if the server has data? So in other words, the administrator knows it has stuff, or there's automatic analysis to determine I can be smarter than the client. You bring up another good point, which is that developers have been doing this for a while, and to a large extent, you're documenting what code is actually already doing in some cases. I would actually suggest that yours and the multiple responses draft actually are a good combination, and that they actually ought to be combined, because in both cases, they're talking about returning extra data to the client, either because the developer thought it was a good idea, the server was smart and thought it was a good idea, or the administrator of the server was smart and created a config, regardless whether it's another magical R type or not. So I guess consider that, and we'd be happy to do a merge on our end, I think, or at least a couple of us that talked would.
Thank you.
Benno Overeiner, NLNet Labs. Thank you. Very good draft. We have to look at the minimal response size, that kind of things. But we are happy to, well, I'm happy to help you and to work out on this work. I think it's a very good proposal, and we would like to work with you on that. To make it, to implement it in our resolvers, and to push the draft forward. Thanks.
Hello, this is Mokan from ISC. In Bind, we are actually moving away from having large responses and going towards minimal responses, where we only answer the question very pertinently. We don't add any extra luggage to the answer response message. Now, there are two ways of sending additional responses. One is for the server to think what is right for the client to have, and for the server to hand out whatever it thinks is right for the client to have. The other way to do this is for the client to request whatever it wants, just what it wants, and the server responds with that information. Now, I prefer the latter. I prefer the client requesting what it wants, and this is Ray's multi-queue types idea. I don't think it's a good idea for the server to add whatever it wants to the response. The reason is that the server has to do considerable work, internal queries into its own database to add additional things to the answer response. That takes time, basically. If it adds something to the answer and the client eventually ends up throwing it away, it's wasted work. So I think it's better that the client requests what it wants and the server just gives it what it wants. That's it.
This is Andre from ISC. What I'm also a big proponent of the minimal answers, but what I'm missing from all those proposals, or maybe I just didn't remember, is some analysis what we are actually saving, because adding additional answers is increasing complexity, and it's increasing complexity in the resolver code and in a step resolver possibly as well. And it increases the packet sizes, increasing the DDoS vector. So basically what I would like to see is an analysis of real world data from some resolver, for example, if this like save in the latency is actually outweighed the risks of larger responses and additional complexity in the code. Because I more fear the additional complexity in the code, because that's it's always easier to throw away like everything in the additional if you not have asked for it, just because of the security reasons, because you might miss a corner case and your cache gets poisoned. And the other thing is that in your draft, this is for resolver. Well, if you're talking about authoritative sending multiple responses to resolver, again, is this really helpful? Because this only helps with bootstrapping or domains that have really low TTL, because after that it's already in the cache. And for stop to resolver, I'm hoping that the war will move to DNS over TLS everywhere. Henceforth, we will have a TCP connection and henceforth we will just can ask for multiple answers in the same channel. So maybe, just maybe we are beating a dead horse here.
So I think all of this is solving a 0.0 something % problem, because most of the stuff in resolvers and DNS is cached. And I gave a talk about how effective it is. If you look for the top 100 domains, you have cache hit rates above, say, 99%. And DNSSEC in this is simply not existent. I mean, so for the vast majority, this doesn't give you anything. And as said, it's complexity in the code. So, I mean, there are, I think, other things we should work on this.
Dave Lawrence Akamai, I want to acknowledge Ralph's point that yes, cache does have a tremendously large effect here, but as, for example, the Happy Eyeballs project by Apple has shown, is it's really not a sufficient answer to wanting to know multiple types at one time. And as Wes and I have discussed in the past too, the multi-queue types and multi-responses / additional answers are in slightly different problem spaces. They can both be independently useful. And I still support multi-queue types as the one bit that I disagree with is that the code size differences are large. But the thing that I agree with very much is that the deployment on that is gradual, and it's gradually in control of the client. A client can ask, and you know positively whether the server that you're asking supports the option or not, and then can move forward based on that information. Whereas additional answers not only demands DNSSEC in order to function effectively, but also really for a client to understand whether the server did it is a kind of, you don't have a good signal there if the server doesn't actually support it.
Jian Kangyang from Cynical. Prefer a slide, please.
What?
Prefer slide. Yes. So for this issue, there are now have five drafts. So it proves that this working group is very interesting in this topic. So may in future we use some energy to solve this issue. So we can choose one proposal or solution, or combine this different solution together to make a new solution. So Fujiwara already saw a very nice slide. Yes, so already have a good chart of that demonstrate the comparison of proposals. In next step, we may analyze them in depth. So choose one solution or compare different solutions. So my comments, so it improves. This working group is very interested in this topic. Thank you.
Hi, Carl Henderson, VeriSign. I guess my concern when I was reading this is it needs a cost-benefit analysis. In other
Can you
words,
speak up maybe a little bit closer to the microphone?
I'm sorry. Can you
Thank
guys
you.
hear me now?
Thank you.
Good cost-benefit analysis. In other words, weighing how often we actually get the cache hits for the other R types versus the response bloat, the extra bandwidth, and the CPU. So it might be a good thing to do, but I really think it needs a lot more analysis.
Jim Reed, a cheerful Scot. What the previous guy just said, I think we need a lot more data to do some reasonable cost-benefit analysis on this proposal. There was something similar discussed in Berlin. I think there was also a comparable proposal from Warren about this kind of thing. And there was a promise made then that more data would be gathered and presented to the working group so we could make some objective decisions about that. As far as I know, that data has never been presented. So maybe we need to try to go back to those first principles and do some analysis, just like has been suggested, because although I think this is a good idea, I think that we still need to figure out the cost benefit analysis here in terms of both the code complexity and the exposure to things like amplification attacks. I'm very concerned about the prospect of adding more needless data into a response and then amplifying the amount of data coming back and then using that for all sorts of nasty DDoS attacks. If we don't have to send extra data back, or it's really not going to give us a great deal of optimization, why do it?
I went back and read the Berlin minutes the other day, and basically the consensus that came out of that room was people like the clients asking rather than servers telling, right?
Yeah.
But there are in some cases like with the MX and the SRV where, you know, they just send all of it because they know it's going to be used, kind of thing. So, and I can dig up the Berlin minutes again, but yeah, you're correct. That seemed to be the consensus coming out of the room basically at that time.
Okay.
So.
Bill Manning. I look at this and I think this is a lovely menu for an attack profile. We have increasingly complex code in both server and client. We have extra bandwidth utilization. We have much more data being pushed around that may or may not be used based on the assumptions of one side or the other. The black hat side of me looks at this with glee and excitement as other ways to break the DNS.
Joe Abley, I think it is actually worth including the additional column, which is what we do today, send parallel queries. And if the only concern with that is that it takes more bandwidth, then really we have to remember that the amount of bandwidth that's actually used by queries is already almost zero compared to the amount of bandwidth we had to provision for all the rest of the shit that arrives at the servers. So it's free. And it requires no code changes and no changes in any expectations and no drafts. So I think that column's worth including.
Hi, hi, David from BI. And I heard I saw that there are a list of the draft that want to carry more information in DNS message. But my concern is that the DNS large response. So I just as a remind that there is a draft, it's a sleeping and is to flag the DNS in the DNS level. So if we decide to proceed on the multiple response, we need to consider about the transport issues, especially in the IPv6 environment, because I think there are wide discussions on these issues, and many people view IPv6 is not very workable for the large DNS response. So in the context of this draft and the multiple response, so is it possible, or is it worth of considering to think about the transport issues? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for the proposal. I am actually in strong agreement with it, and I'd be very happy to help in reviewing it.
I'm sorry, could you speak closer to the microphone? I couldn't hear you.
I said I'm in agreement with the proposal. I'm Isabel. I'm an ISOC fellow, and I'd be happy to help in reviewing it.
That was going to be the next question. We've got. Go ahead.
So what and I've been massively taking notes. What I just heard from the line is we don't know what is being reviewed next. Yeah. Are we reviewing a draft? Are we reviewing the idea of questions versus answers and such like that? And so if we start reviewing a draft, that's sort of suggesting something. So can you tell us what you would like us to review?
Yes, thank you for getting up to the microphone as I was beginning to speak to exactly that point. What we're hearing is a lot of interest, you know, as a couple of folks mentioned, we're hearing a lot of interest in this general problem space. We do have several drafts that are either competing proposals or complementary proposals, and it's a little bit hard to tell which. I mean, this chart is very good to that point, and thank you for doing this. But I think the comments we heard that there's still some more discussion we need. I think that's absolutely true. And it's kind of a moving target. But what I'd like to start with is use cases. What problems do any of these proposals solve that people actually have? And that's when we can start to sort out, are these things worth doing? Are they worth additional complexity? Are there security considerations that will need to be mitigated or managed? But first we have to, what I heard at least, and Tim can twist my arm if I'm confused here, but what I heard was a fair amount of, this is either a cool solution or not, but to a problem we haven't formed well. So who's willing to work on use cases? Not necessarily a draft even, but discussion on that we can take to the list of what problems these different drafts are solving and where we can go from there. I see Tail's hand. And I see Isabel in the back. And Isabel, who is just at the microphone.
Yep. And I can guide you all. How's that?
Yeah, because this sounds like what we need to do is have people be able to say which of these proposals they like or don't like, and why. And I heard Wes offering perhaps a combined draft. I think it's a little bit too soon to say that that's necessarily where we want to go, but please keep that in mind. Because if it turns out that these drafts are complementary as far as solving related problems, that might very well be a direction we want to go. But we need to sort out what folks are interested in.
Yep. And we'll probably we'll do a lot of that based on this table. And so if people think like, oh, there needs to be another line in the table that defines X, Y, or Z sort of thing, right? Or we think this is wrong, or we think this is great. I think this is fairly accurate. I think, you've marked some stuff in red that you're not sure about. And I think, but if people think, oh, this is incorrect, please, let's, because this is a very good way for people to actually quickly see where all the places sort of get tweaked sort of thing. So, and I just remember going back and reading all the Berlin minutes and all the various comments about stuff. That was the thing that took me a little bit to sort of wind through. So.
Yeah, Ray Vellis, I see. Certainly the table does need some work. For example, the resolve the modification table, currently there's some nice big greens on the first two. There shouldn't be no's, they should be not applicable, because those two proposals don't actually give recursive resolver support.
Thanks for signing up to help fix that.
Well, I'm an author of competing drafts, so I can't be objective on this, but I should point out, actually, that draft has now been around for 5 years since I first published this -00.
Okay.
Very frustrated that we had no progress on this since Berlin.
Anybody else who's moved by the spirit of volunteering to further this discussion, see our secretary so he knows to come back and twist your arm. Paul, raise your hand. Thank you. And at the microphone.
And Dave Lawrence, I'm recommending that Ray work on it anyway. I don't see that that subjectivity is a real problem here. I mean, we all have our biases. It's not like we're involved in some kind of fiscal, fiduciary responsibility thing here. We're trying to come up with the best proposal. And so advocating for your proposal, I think, is a perfectly valid part of the process, pointing out why yours is good and, how that fits into things. So to that end, I think that, Wes should be involved. I have my biases that I've stated before, and I'm going to be involved. And so I don't think that should stop Ray.
Alex Mayover. A quick point. I would like to come back to the point of cost-benefit analysis. I think it would be really, really useful if an operator of a big recursive DNS has a couple of PhD students, maybe something like that, and does actually a cost simulation, and a benefit simulation. So if we find out that a proposal, one of those proposals, like saves us 0.02% of the DNS queries, it's obviously not a big benefit. But I think we need to understand, together with the use cases that we're hopefully going to see on the mailing list, how much of whatever, traffic, bandwidth, round trip times, does each of those proposals actually save in practice on the network? Yeah. Because it's DNS op. Yeah.
Very good, thank you. I think that closes that topic for now. for now, and we'll take the follow-up to the list and undoubtedly future discussions. So I think it's Danielle is next.
Good morning, Good morning. So I'm going to talk about the DNSSEC validator requirements draft we have. So basically the motivation for that draft is that there exists some requirements about how you do the DNSSEC validations. However, there is a number of situations where the DNSSEC validator is not able to process to an appropriate DNSSEC validation. So what this draft is discussing is what are the mechanisms a DNSSEC validator should have.
I think you need to be closer to the microphone. Oh, there we go.
So this draft is about describing what are the necessary mechanisms a DNSSEC validator should have so that DNSSEC validators can be performed appropriately. So what we're talking about is provisioning mechanisms, monitoring mechanisms, and management mechanisms. But the idea is that DNSSEC validators could really enable DNSSEC after all. So, well, the draft is in the version 6 now. It has been progressing through the different versions, and we think the draft is in pretty good shape. We have something like 20 requirements, but I'd like to use the time for this presentation to go to some questions and to get the feedbacks from what you think about the problem we're facing now. So this is how the description of the DNSSEC validator. So you have okay, well, the arrows are not at the right place, but that's so, well, you have a timing source that is providing time for signature validations. You have the crypto libraries, which are used for performing the signature checks. The other component you have is a trust anchor. So this trust anchor is filled by the DNSSEC validation engine. The DNSSEC validation engines need those trust anchor to perform the DNSSEC validations. And you have also I'm trying to find the right button, which is not this. I'm trying to have a pointer.
Oh, the green.
Okay. Okay, the one. Yeah. Okay. So, and this arrow shows that you have some kind of management where the trust anchor, for example, when you have a key rollover, perform some kind of logics. So the logics for updating the keys, the trust anchors is represented with this arrow. The problem we have is about the KSK and ZSK that are in the cache. So the DNSSEC validations fill the cache, but also needs the KSK and ZSKs to perform the validation. So the question we have is probably among others, but that's the current questions we're facing, is that we have some status for the KSK and ZSK. However, this status does not provide any, well, are not clearly stating whether the KSK or the ZSK can be trusted and used for the validations. So what we would like to know if there is a consensus on what is a non-trusted key. So from the status, as well as from, let's say, the time a status has been changed or this kind of things. If you have any feedback, please go to the mic, and even though you go to the mic, please send that to the mailing list. Basically, the idea would be that once a key is not trusted anymore, signature is not being performed, and our set are just being rejected. And some kind of other question is whether once a KSK or a ZSK is not anymore trusted, what happens to the ZSK, KSK that are in the chain of trust? So this is actually the question we would appreciate to get some feedbacks. Then we have another question, which is once you have some cache that is filled with R set that has been validated by a KSK ZSK, and this KSK ZSK is not anymore trusted, what do you do with the R set in the cache? Do you trust them? Do you consider as trusted, or do you want to purge those? Do you want to keep track of which key has been used for each R set, for example? So those are the questions we would appreciate to get some feedbacks.
My fellow Noam, I think in general this is good work, and I really liked it up to, I think, requirement 8, and then the KSK, ZSK stuff lost me, because we have in the DNS, I mean, the notion of the TTL and how we put stuff in cache and out, that's kind of set in stone. Why should a validator be different there?
Yeah, that's so basically what the reason we are also asking these feedbacks is that we don't want to, have too much requirement, and basically as much as possible we would like to make the protocol work as it is. So if it's fine, we're not looking for additional requirements.
Jim Reid, DNS guy from Scotland. I kind of disagree with what Ralph's just said there. I think some of the Rust work here is a bad idea. And the idea of revoking data that's in the cache because a key's gone bad all of a sudden doesn't seem quite right to me. And I think it could be an interesting vector for all sorts of denial of service attacks and compromises on resolving servers. So I'm not convinced this is necessarily a good idea.
So just to rephrase, what you're saying is that we should just let the TTL work and do the job.
I think so. We've got enough mechanism with TTLs and with the signature expiry times and key revocation. I think you should trust those mechanisms rather than try to add complexity to something that's already a very, very complicated thing.
Joe, please. I agree with Jim. I think the word suddenly shouldn't feature here, because I think the timing should be controlled by the people who publish the data in the DNS and not by people, ideally, who have to make guesses about the intentions of the people who published it. So I think it's a bad idea. I think obeying TTLs makes more sense. I had one other comment, which is not one of your questions, which is you also include a number of sections that relate to bootstrapping and retrieving trust anchors. And you use the unbound anchor approach as an example. That was written in response to a now long expired document that specifically addressed validator bootstrap that I would still really like the working group to pick up. And I think that is, especially given our current experience, I think that would be a great thing to pick back up and actually publish in its own right separately. I think this draft is more concerned with other issues about a steady state validator than bootstrapping. I think bootstrapping in this draft looks like it should be off to the side.
Yeah, we are not designing any mechanism. Well, we're just saying we need a mechanism for bootstrapping, and then we cite the different document that has been written. I think we are mentioning the document you're...
I may have missed a reference, yeah.
Okay.
But my other point there is that we may see the mechanisms by which we recommend a validator picks up a trust anchor change over time, because we may learn things from KSK roles it would be a shame to have to rev an entire document like this just because that particular mechanism has changed. So I'm just really just reaffirming my opinion that everybody already knows that the other document is good.
Eric Oswald, VeriSign. So I want to agree with Jim and Joe on the first point, I think, but sort of just to sort of clarify my perspective, I don't think the TTL is necessarily part of the validating process. So, I mean, like the caching aspect of it, you might just say that's a separate issue because I think it kind of is. So I agree with them. I think trying to put that into the validation discussion is making it more complicated than it needs to. Caching is separate, and there's a whole bunch of thinking around that. So I would separate that out. And the only thing I'd say is I think it's worth spending some time. I haven't read the draft, so if this is in there, I apologize for being redundant. But what to do with revoked keys? After a key's been revoked, that's kind of like a permanent statement. But if it gets flushed out of cache or forgotten and a revoked key can be reused again, that could potentially be a problem. So I see possibly this draft as a place to put some thinking in, some writing in, some specification in for what happens when you see a revoked key, because nominally you may need to keep that around forever.
I'm going to close the mic line at this point because we're starting to have to be mindful of time.
Russ Mundy. I won't speak to your first question, Daniel, but the second one, I think that if there is a sudden revocation, then everything associated with that key in the cache should be flushed, because if it's in there as either a negative or positive validation, the validation, if the key is in fact revoked, should be terminated. The other question that I have, though, I am having a hard time envisioning the sudden revocation or untrust condition. I don't know that there's been a accurate or a valid scenario written up for that. Is that something that, such as a compromise, an emergency rollover, is that what you have in mind there?
So I get the first part, but the second part I didn't really get. You mean a reallocation?
Well, the reason for it becoming suddenly revoked or suddenly untrusted, is this pointed at handling an emergency
it could
compromise
be,
kind of situation? Okay. Yeah, I still think the idea, it would be good to flush the cache if something is revoked.
Thank you.
Wes Herdeker, ISI. Speaking as with my hat of not writing, resolver code, because I don't, but I can't imagine any cache author wanting to keep a chain of keys and then have to go search through it. So to me, that's like a non-implementation starter. That's a huge memory footprint and everything. So then the question becomes, all right, assuming that that's not valid to do, what are our choices? And I think people have already outlined the two choices. Is one, you don't care and you keep the TTL and related data in the cache, or two, you could just wipe the whole cache, right? But then you end up with a different attack where, if I could get you to come to some little zone and I keep revoking the key, then you're going to always be wiping your cache, and the cache becomes, so the reality is data producers today already have the mechanisms for deciding how long information that is put in a cache because it has been proven valid can stay there, and their TTL fields and signature expiration fields. And I'm a security geek, right? I'd want to be able to go back and revoke everything, but I don't see a viable mechanism for doing that easily. So I think that the TTL and the sig expiration fields are the only thing you have to go on, and I don't think that you should even, unless you can come up with some magical solution that makes it really easy to do, and I don't see one. I think this is a non-starter.
Dwayne Wessels from VeriSign. I see the document uses ZSK and KSK quite a bit, and I would just encourage you to be very careful with that and make sure that all this works with folks that choose to use just one key for signing their zones. Maybe talk about SCP bit rather than KSK and ZSK, because these are really just hints and for our convenience, right?
I did close the mic line, so keep it quick.
So very quick point. Suddenly revoked key, what if it's the root key? Are we then going around and change everybody's cache?
I didn't get that.
If the suddenly revoked key is the root's KSK or ZSK, are we then going around and change everybody's cache in the whole internet?
That's,
All right, so we've discussed this now in a couple of meetings, and what Tim and I are sitting here trying to figure out is, Do we think it's ready to consider adoption, or do we think it needs more work before we're ready to consider adopting it? So can I hear a hum? People who think this document is interesting, useful, ready for adoption, please hum now. Okay, folks who think it needs more review and more input before we should be committing formally to it, please hum now. Not a clear outcome. How many people have read the draft? Okay, then what we should be doing is asking for more people to read the draft and form an opinion about whether this work is worth putting effort into. Thank you. Oh, I see.
Suzanne, you only asked 2 questions, and there's a third question that you didn't ask that I think might represent the opinion of people in the room, which is don't do it. That's not particularly my opinion. I'm just saying that based on what I heard at the mic.
Fair enough. I guess what I was asking for was people to consider further, but we can also ask now. Do people, if you think you've already made up your mind this is not work worth doing, please hum now. Okay, so I'm not hearing clear conviction in any particular direction. So let's folks who are interested should pursue it, and we'll see what happens with further work on it. Thank you, Daniel. And I think Jeff Houston is next.
Hi, this is Jeff Houston from APNIC. I will be intentionally brief. There's not a lot here. As you're probably aware, if you've got any interest in this whatsoever, the planned key roll of October the 11th has been postponed. The reason for that, and again, I'm sure you're aware, is that the signal that came back from the early adoption of the mechanism in RFC 8145 suggested that the take-up of the new key, the new KSK, was not universal, and that the pool of resolvers that was signaling that they had not taken up this new key was significant enough for the ICANN folk to feel it was time to pause and reflect, which is fair enough. It was a good call. But there's a lot of trouble with interpreting that signal. It's a signal that moves inward with the query. It doesn't go backwards to the querier. And so the aggregate signal, the composite of all of these signals, is actually only visible to the root servers. DNS forwarders and local caching suppress the query moving inward. So at some point you get a real issue that the signal you've got is not easy to do attribution. The real question that they're wanting to ask is not answered by this in any case. How many users might be affected and go dark when the key rolls is not the same as looking at supposed resolvers, because you can't tell attribution, and you don't even know if the user has alternate resolvers that they could have used if the one that they were using this point went dark, because etc.resolve.conf normally has a few things in it. So there's a lot of trouble with this kind of signal. And the question in my mind is, at any point, would any investigation yield sufficient levels of confidence in this signal to proceed? And, I worry that the answer is no. There's always so much ambiguity when you're trying to ask a question about users when the mechanism of answering it is resolver-centric. So maybe there's a different way of doing it. And maybe if you're asking a question about users, we should look at users and look at it from a user-centric viewpoint. So the question is, can you devise a query that could reveal the state of those trusted keys in not just a resolver, but the resolver system that the user actually uses? And, the basic answer is we can't do that. But in the same way as 8145 proposed a mechanism to change the behavior of resolvers, what if we proposed a mechanism that altered the DNSSEC validation outcome based on the presence of a label in the query name? And the proposal is relatively simple. It's a proposal to add a resolver mechanism that if a query contains a generic label of the form _is-ta- and an encoded key tag, then a validating resolver will report validation failure, RCode 2 or whatever, if the key is not in the trusted key store. Simple as that. And because of the way the logic works, there's a negative as well, which is a negative question, underscore not TA key tag, and that will report validation failure if the key is in the trusted key store. Why do you do that? Because you actually need to do a relatively complete table of analysis. There are basically 4 resolver types that you're searching for if you're thinking about a single resolver. I've loaded the new KSK and I'm validating and I have the mechanism. I haven't loaded the new KSK, but I'm validating and I'm aware of this mechanism. Or I'm validating and I'm not doing it. Or I'm not validating, I don't care. Now, if you actually phrase 3 queries using the positive label, the negative label, and a generically badly signed domain name, just any old name that doesn't validate, the table at the base of that page will actually tell you which kind of resolver you're looking at if it was a single resolver. Okay, you can sort that out. But what if you do multiple resolvers? Serve fail causes you to ask more. And by doing that analysis, you can actually say, well, oddly enough, the user will keep on flicking through, and what they'll end up with is a slightly larger table, but you can still, the user can still basically figure out what their DNS is doing for them without necessarily understanding which resolver is doing what. The serve fail will cause the query to move to another resolver. This will also work in caching, and it will work when forwarders are being used. Because basically what you get is, if the end result of those 3 queries is A, serve fail, and serve fail, my DNS is okay. If it's serve fail A, serve fail, I'm in deep shit. Did I just say that? I'm in deep trouble. You know. There are 2 other sort of responses that you can't sort out. AA serve fail and serve fail, serve fail. That's the pool of things which are kind of the big pool of uncertainty. And last, if you're not impacted, you'll get A's for everything because you're using at least one resolver that's not validating, and that will give you a clue that you're okay. That's just what I said. When you start mucking around with the answers in DNSSEC, I think you do need to actually understand whether you're creating a trouble or not. And what I'm trying to do here in the security and privacy considerations is talk about the fact the query doesn't identify the user, nor does the answer. It doesn't actually reveal which resolvers are being used. It's not meant to. It never changes insecure to secure or authenticated. It only downgrades, it never upgrades. Because it's just a label, not a golden name, anyone can set it up. Anyone. It's not exclusive to you, me, or anyone else with access to a particular label. And in fact, the way it works is only the user gets to see the answer. Okay. So that's what I'm proposing here. It's certainly susceptible to mass measuring techniques. And the technique that we use to measure DNSSEC validation in APNIC, which uses an add to perform gets perform DNS, you can use the process here, certainly is susceptible to this kind of measurement. Users can measure their own DNS the same way ISPs can measure their own resolver systems, the same mechanism. It's not exclusive for anyone to do this. So in talking about this and talking to the folk at ICANN going, what's going to help you? It certainly seems that this could be of use. And it would certainly be useful for DNS resolver manufacturers to have this available and to actually implement this mechanism. One conversation I had is, if I'm a validating resolver, do I have to look for this label on every single response? Is that a lot of work? Could be. That's why we have computers. But one of the ways to alleviate that is to specify maybe it should be the leftmost label rather than any label. Whatever. If you want to talk about that, that's fine. I'm certainly interested if you think that's a suitable addition to the draft. But other than that, I don't have any questions. Maybe you do. I think I do because of resolver folk wanting to cite a standard. So we are looking for adoption at some point.
Yeah, I think given that the draft is a couple of weeks old, and and I see a long mic line, long enough that I'm probably gonna have to close it like now.
A bunch of letters.
Yeah, but what we'd like to hear is sort of preliminary comments, and we're looking for reviewers.
Benno Overeiner, NL Net Labs. We think, or I think, it's a good draft. One remark: it's you reserve a label in every zone, but if we can get some consensus on the name of the label, we had already some discussions about the underscore is TA or not, etc. But if there's a consensus on the naming, etc., and there's some convergence here, we will implement it in Unbound. Thanks.
The name was deliberately chosen to start with an underscore, so in theory, it's not a host name, which doesn't have underscores. And it was sort of, the leading underscore was meant to look like a lot of the other things that are special use because of leading underscore. The is TA was almost borrowed from 8145 in some ways. It was meant to be just a descriptive piece of text with a key tag. Quite frankly, if someone inadvertently creates this kind of label, don't do that. That's a bad thing if you expect answers that work. Use it if you want to test. Don't use it for real if it's the name of a thing. Yeah.
So, Ray Bellis, ISC. So, Jeff, as I understand it, you're proposing to use this in systems similar to your current advertising-based framework.
Me? Yes. You? Go nuts, whichever way you want.
In those frameworks, can you actually tell the difference in, for example, client-side browser code between a DNS lookup failure and a failure to retrieve whatever resource is pointed to at the A record that resolves to?
Yes.
You can?
Yes.
Okay, I'm curious because I'm not sure. I've done a fair bit of web and Ajax program. I'm not sure how one would do
Reach
that.
deeply in and ask for the resolution time.
Okay, so as a side channel, but the corollary of that is potential. No, you're probably okay.
I'm aware of this, Ray,
yeah.
and it would be really, really good just for me alone if DNSSEC validated NS records, but the rest of the room would go nuts and the microphone line would reach to the back of the room. So I'm not asking for that.
So
but we think we can eliminate the noise by effectively asking the browser to report back on resolution time so that we can get the remote control signal.
Okay, and you don't therefore actually care what the A record content is.
Oh, I'll give them a 1-by-1 PNG to keep them happy.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Hi, Jeff. This is Andre IC. I actually have a question. What should happen if the key tag is not a key tag?
If the key tag is not a key tag, send back what you were going to send back. Don't change the answer. This just changes good to bad under very particular circumstances. Everything else, just ignore it.
So, but that expects processing, like.
Well, the grep is kind of.
How would you know if it's a key tag? So you need to.
I was going to say, and I think it does say in the draft, it's a hash string. So look for a string, A through F, 0 through 9.
So you would just accept numerical values, because, well, maybe if you
change good to bad if a key with that same hash value is in your trusted key store.
Yes,
if you don't understand the key, if nothing else, just leave it alone. And the second is exactly the same in the opposite sense. If you know that key and it's not in your trusted key store, if you know that key, change good to bad.
So if I ask for ista-nonsense, then it should return serfail?
It'll send back whatever it was going to send back from DNSSEC validation. It's never going to change bad to good. So if it validated otherwise, it will say that's okay.
This sounds like a beer in a napkin or
right. The whole issue, Andre, is not that the individual query will give you information, but 3 queries will give you the information you're after. It's the set that makes all the difference here. Right? So you're actually looking at a trio that exposes what your DNS is capable of as your DNS cloud.
I understand that, but I'm just trying to make it more deterministic in terms of, like, like if people start throwing garbage at it.
If you buy him a beer, he'll probably.
Throw garbage at it. No others? Thank you. Oh,
Yeah.
I'm after working group adoption, so what's the next step?
Reviewers?
Since it's brand new.
It's brand new.
What we're looking for is review and brickbats for Jeff.
All right, do I have to offer beers, do I?
Yes, you do.
Oh, okay.
It's
Thanks,
a
Joe.
time-honored way, but, you know, hands raised or see our secretary after the meeting. Because we're going to.
So Warren Kamari, as an author, I'll ask a leading question. How hard does this seem to implement? Like, does it look as though it's going to be really hard to add to code?
I already understand that NOT have added a module to their code already as a preliminary, so it doesn't seem to be very hard to implement.
All right. Okay, one last comment.
Yeah, just very quickly. Since this would be undoubtedly particularly helpful in the context of restarting the KSK role, getting resolution on moving forward with this sooner rather than later would be deeply appreciated, so it could actually be implemented sooner rather than later.
Fair point. Thank you. But we will take further discussion of the mailing list, but we will promote quick further discussion.
Maybe get your employees to do some more reviews. How's that?
Thank you.
Francis is next.
Good idea. So next presentation is about IFC 10845, which is TSIG. So someone reported to some implementers of TSIG a security problem, and when we fix it, we found the problem is the source of the problem was in specifications themselves. So we form a group at the last IETF to see what to do, and we decided to merge and update the TSIG, IFC, and the HMAC SHA IFC, which has a truncation. And so to merge and update them, not to rewrite whole TSIG, do a new protocol, etc. Even each time you read the TSIG, you find things which should be done another way. So want to keep something which is fully compatible. So it was announced at the last IFC by Stephen Morris. Unfortunately, I don't believe the only side of from the presentation of the last IETF is in proceeding. I tried to find it. So what was done? So I published a first version before the deadline, so it's available. And the source of the revision is available on GitHub, so you can see the XML, etc. And the commands offering contributions, etc. are welcome. And so the future for the future we should become working group item. I believe I'll do a new 0.1 version at the end of the week when I'll be back. If I have enough things to put in it, and I believe it will be the case.
Quick show of hands. Who has read this? Okay. So we need some more people to read it.
Yeah.
So speaking as this chair, I do believe it's probably a working group item because this does actually address an interesting flaw in the whole TSIG thing. So, but the group may have other opinions about that. So, but we definitely need more people to read it and give feedback.
Hi, this is Mukund from ISC.
I have read the draft and I've sent comments to the Dnsop list as well. I think that this is definitely needed to fix the synactive bug. Well, there are several issues in 2845 itself. There's confusing language in 2845. There are things that are underspecified in 2845, and the follow-up HMAC, SHA, and the truncation RFC as well. And there are some things that still are questionable in 2845, something related to security. Text from 2845 has largely been copied into this draft because this draft is the best document that's based on 2845. As long as we don't modify the protocol, I think that we should address these deficiencies from 2845 in this draft, not just have that text copied over verbatim without fixing these issues. Now, I did send comments about this to the mailing list, and we should not just say that this 2845 has already been shipped, it's 17 years old, so we cannot do anything about the text. We should clarify the text and basically remove deficiencies from the text.
I would say once we open it up, it's kind of like we're opening everything up, right? So, and you enumerated everything on the list in terms of where you feel that the clarifying text was needed. A yes or no would have.
Yeah, I've quoted this document and basically replied to every part of the document on the list.
Since you both actually work for the same people.
Yeah,
we
do.
Yeah.
There's.
You should be able to work this out, I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I think hopefully some more review, and this week we can give you some feedback as well, because but I guess this is just my opinion, and the working group can, and my co-chair can beat me on it. But once we crack that document open, we probably should sort of address any sort of, questionable language or sort of things that need to be more clarified.
Most of the comments were replied to with, this is 17 years old, this is 17 years old. And I think we should not shy away from modifying this document further.
No, we have things that update 1034 all the time. So, that add clarifying language. So I think that's correct. So, but I think that's, does the working group feel that's basically how we should drive it? So, okay.
But there is one problem. We should not do in this document a TSIG version 2.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
But when we read it, you see a lot of things which should be done another way. And perhaps a good idea to do TSIG version 2, but it's not for this document.
Thank you. Warren, you're next.
Woo, browser-based. So let me start off by saying that I know this is somewhat controversial, and yes, it's somewhat icky. I'll also say that if you are in DNSORG and saw it there, you can ignore most of it because it's basically the same. So this is a thing on .internal. This is currently just a working title. Originally, I was calling it RFC 1918 for names, but that's kind of a bad name. I think it's more a condom for the namespace. So users want a pony. Basically, they want some sort of name for internal or disconnected namespaces. They keep doing stuff like this. We see a bunch of people using these sorts of names. Localhost is a new and interesting one. Local domain has actually suddenly shown up, and I was looking to see why, or at least it's increased in prevalence. Turns out if you install Ubuntu and it's not connected to anything, it decides to name itself localhost.localdomain. And this is a fairly new sort of thing. It's becoming much more prevalent. So people want to use this. We keep telling them no. Users want a pony, but we say this causes issues. You squat on random names. There's some additional root lookups. Potentially it leaks some of your internal namespace. But I think sort of the pollution is the annoying one. Eventually they'll cause collisions. But, users still want a pony. We say, no, you can't have a pony. Actually, what we say is slightly more subtle. what we say is you should go off and register a name. You should go off and register example.com and then put your random stuff under that. You should be, foo.example.com. We're the adults in the room. We know that this is what you should do. It's the right thing to do. Seriously, you should go do this. And that's true. That is the right thing to do. Of course, we also preach abstinence. We tell teens, this is risky behavior. Don't go off and do it. These seem to be about equally useful, right? We can't stop users from doing this. We can't stop teens from having sex. We should probably just acknowledge the fact that we can't stop this and try and deal with it in a way that's not going to hurt. So potentially a way that's not going to hurt is we take a name and we set it aside and we say, this is where you can do stupid, crazy stuff. I've been using .internal because it looks like it's already been squatted on. It kind of describes things. And it's purely for non-technical reasons that it's a TLD. .internal.arpa would obviously work and would be, within our bailiwick. However, users aren't going to do, my intranet.internal.arpa. Instead, they'll just squat on a name. So, that's why potentially a TLD. Obviously, we can't force people to use this either. We can't tell them, go use something that you registered. We can't force them to use this, but at least some set of them will. A number of people who don't really participate in the IETF have said, yes, I really, really want this. I really, really wanted this for a long time. If it existed, I would use it. They might be lying, who knows? But, there are, what did I figure out? 9 times 10 to the 68 possible TLDs. I think we should just set one aside, squat on it and say, well, not squat on it, officially get it and say, this is where you can do your crazy stuff. Oh, well. Obviously, just like 1918, if 2 companies are using .internal and merge, they're going to have a sad time. I think that's just something that we note in the document and say, this is your space. Go off and do whatever you will. If you're going to merge these things, you're going to have a bad day. Oh, well. Yes, this is all kind of icky, and I've acknowledged that multiple times. However, I think that if we don't give users this, they're just going to continue to squat on stuff. So, let's just give them their pony. That way, hopefully, they won't sort of squat on other random names and burn down our namespace. And also, I just kind of like the picture. So, tomatoes. I know there are going to be at least a bunch. Hi, Andrew. Where's Bill?
Jim Reed, I got here first. One, I think this is probably a good idea that we have a reserved top-level domain for this kind of internal corporate nonsense. I'm not so sure it's a good idea that we want to try and get a delegation for it in the root. I think that will create all sorts of problems, and we'll go back and revisit all the hassles we've just essentially closed off with .homenet. I think the problem we're going to get there is primarily issues around the ICANN policy about applying for a TLD and getting an insecure delegation. I do think there's a mechanism for that in place at ICANN already, and I think you've been a world of hurt if you're down that particular path. So why can't we just say .internal is set aside for these private internal uses, write up an RFC for it and be done with it. And then if people want to use those internal domain names with a trust anchor, they instantiate their own trust anchor for it, and we're done.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, the reason that we at Delicities had and we needed DNSSEC and secure delegation was because otherwise DNSSEC breaks. And we could always we will put it on the normal reserved list. We could ask for a delegation in parallel. If it happens, yay. If it doesn't, meh, don't really care. But there's a ICANN person.
Well, Alan, John, I'm not speaking on behalf of ICANN, and I'm not going to make a comment about should it be a TLD or not. That's not why I came to the microphone for. You're talking about mergers here. I just wanted to point out that that's not the only problem. The problem is when you make referrals and you pass referrals to other parties in your application. And then if you make a referral with my machine name .internal to somebody that is not in the same internal network, then you have a problem.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we have seen that in site local addresses. I mean, it's not just about mergers. So if you want to specify something in the document, you should maybe extend the problem to space.
I think that the document currently says, if you take your laptop and go to a coffee shop, you're going to try and reserve www.internal, and who knows where that will get you. But yeah, we should stress that more in there.
Hi, Warren. It's Joe Averley here. So on the delegation question, I sent some mail to the list about this, so I don't need to repeat that. I don't think there needs to be a DNAME or a delegation for this. I don't think there's any actual technical policy issues here for the IETF. I don't think there's any implementation issues that the IETF needs to ask the IANA or anybody else to do. I don't think there's any work here for the IETF, and I think we actively don't want work anywhere close to this. If anybody's going to do work in reserve.internal, it should be ICANN, let their processors handle it. There's no reason to get involved in this. There's no IETF work here.
My name is Andrew Sullivan. I completely agree with Joe, and moreover, on the previous slide, I think, you say that there's no process for this and it requires creating one, but it doesn't require creating one here. It requires creating one in another place. That is, you got to go create that in ICANN. And so for the same reason that you have to go and create that in ICANN, you have to create a new rule for delegating something that would not be an operational TLD, not allowed to delegate things under official things, et cetera, at ICANN. This is not IETF work. It doesn't belong here. Get it out of here.
Okay. So just to be clear, the would require creating one would be require a way for the IAB or someone to ask ICANN. That was all. But yeah, they would need to figure that out.
So actually, never mind.
Whoever takes this to the other organization, mind you, this is an English language word in ASCII character set limits. Given that we're in Singapore and you look around, internationalization is a good example here. So.
David Conrad, ICANN, but not speaking on behalf of ICANN, even if I knew what I was going to be saying. I'm a little confused as to why there's a feeling that this should be thrown over to ICANN, since ICANN deals with DNS stuff. I would have thought that this would be a nominee for the special use names RFC. So
me too.
I just really confused.
Bernie Volz. I just want to suggest one other thing. If you do proceed with this, is you might suggest that somebody, instead of just using hostname.internal, use hostname. Your company's domain name.internal or something, because that then would solve at least some of the issues with two companies merging or you going into coffee shop, right? It would reduce the chance of collisions.
This is Andrew Sullivan again. Just to respond to what David asked, this is not a special use domain name. There's nothing special about it. This is a name in the DNS. It's just a name in the DNS that happens to be a split horizon. If we think that split horizon is a good idea and this working group wants to embrace new ways to make split horizons work even worse than they already do, then that's fine. But the name in question is none of our business, because it's just a standard delegation. It's just that it's a standard delegation with a completely ambiguous context as to where you've delegated it. There's nothing weird about this in DNS terms in the protocol. It's an insane idea, but that's a different problem.
So I will fully fess up that this is truly not a special use name. Probably the IETF is not the right place. It's simply the IETF isn't possibly an easier place to get people to discuss this. And it's not something where there is money. So yeah, okay. I suspect this is a bad idea.
When David Conrad will have the last word on this, so the mic line closes with him. How's that? No, you go. Yep.
Edmund Chung here. So in terms of ICANN, hearing so much about ICANN, I think this work should be in ICANN, and actually the ICANN board just commissioned in the meeting in Abu Dhabi, just commissioned a full-scale study on names collision through the SSAC, the Security and Stability Advisory Committee. So I encourage you to go there, and I think that process is supposed to be open. I was hoping David would mention it, but anyway, so there is actually a particular discussion on names collision that is going to be happening at ICANN.
Stuart Cheshire from Apple. I have a quick comment, not so much directed at you, Warren, but towards several of the comments that were made. In your presentation, you made this joking reference, "I want a pony," repeatedly.
And you pointed out that end users and organizations are doing this already. And we sit here at the IETF, burying our heads in the sand, pretending it's not happening and pretending we can stop them. ICANN's own leakage reports show widespread use of .home and .arpa. We've already had this little dance at the IETF where we pretend .home doesn't exist and we call it home.arpa instead. It's not clear whether anybody outside the IETF will care about that. They'll probably carry on using .home. So people talked about problems with referrals and mergers. One use case I view for this is bootstrapping. You buy a new piece of hardware out of the box, and this is the default configuration. If you have a domain name for your company that is registered and paid for every year, you don't need to use mycompanyname.com.arpa, .internal, as somebody else suggested, because you already have a globally unique, fully qualified domain name that you can use for all your names. This is for the product you buy on the shelf in Best Buy, and it doesn't know what your domain name is, and maybe the first thing you do is configure it. But to configure it, you have to talk to it, and talk to it has to get on the network, so there's this bootstrap process. So I think there are use cases like that that are valuable, and even though it may only exist for 1 hour while you're setting it up, that 1 hour could be a very painful hour if you can't get the device and you're pulling out serial cables and VT100 terminals to configure this piece of hardware.
That's a wonderful use case. Makes perfect sense. I guess what I'm still struggling a bit with is how something like .internal would be different than .local or anything else that's been put into the special use names registry. There is an effort underway that's, as Edmund mentioned, looking at name collisions, but that seems to be somewhat orthogonal to this. So I don't actually think it matters so much where the work is done. If it's done at ICANN, that sort of suggests it's only sort of DNS related, and it'll take a lot longer than probably people would like. If it's thrown into the special use names registry with an RFC that says this is for the kind of use case that Stuart was describing, I think it would be done, and we wouldn't have, well, we would have these conversations again, but at least we could point them at an RFC.
So yeah, we're done. Sorry, unless you got 5 words to say. Focus.
If the kludge is to delegate this unsigned, it's ICANN's problem. If the kludge is to special case it in resolvers and stuff, it's our problem. Take your pick.
Yep. Okay. Thanks. So, thank you. That seems to be the end of most of the schedule portion. I wanted to just run down a couple of things because we do actually have some spare time for once. On the highlights, on the terminology biz document, shoot for 1:15 on a working group last call and have some folks start reviewing some of the concepts. I've seen some good, starting to see discussions on the mailing list, and I like that. So that's good. On the 5011, Wes has a new version coming out, or he has one, and once we see that, and if Mike and Ed are mollified, we'll probably kick off like a working group last call for 1 week, do a short one just to make sure we've covered all the pieces. On the XPF document, Joe and Sarah need to give us some review, and then we can probably push forward on some sort of call for adoption and see what people think. The additional answers kind of really opens up that whole bigger discussion about framing it, and I've got a list of people that will sit down and try to help sort of frame that whole discussion. And then under the KSK role and the last couple, the 2845, if we can get some reviews this week and we can see some good reviews on the list, or if I can see the authors put out a new version, I'd like to do call for adoptions basically in the next couple weeks. So let's try to see if we can sort of get some feedback. I think both those are pretty relevant, as folks said, even the KSK Sentinel one. So let's see if we can go with that.
Yeah, as long as you're here, you can spend some time on some of these drafts, and particularly mindful of David's request regarding the KSK role draft. We would like to be able to take quick action on that. Not comfortable taking immediate action on it because it is new and people need a chance to read it, but please make a few minutes and read it, and we'll try to keep that moving. to help out the folks that actually have to deal with the KSK role. Also want to point out two things we didn't get to today. Wes Hardiker had a demo of a new service he's prototyping for RFC 7706, which is local caching of the root zone. For those who believe that things like the root name servers and things like that are too political, and the answer is to move them out of their current critical role, this is the sort of thing they should be looking at. Wes, please raise your hand so that people know to find you and buy you a beer and look at the demo. And I'm sorry?
Yes.
We had some late breaking requests regarding agendas, which it turned out.
We turned down the Thursday slot. So.
And also, Tariq Saraf, if you would raise your hand, a draft that we didn't get to, but he's asking for a review for a new ORR type, the IVI PTR type. So raise your hand and take a few minutes and review the draft because he's looking for feedback on that. Anything else?
Oh, and as a new author, please give him a little courtesy of giving a little extra minute. Even though it is a new R type, it doesn't need a lot of review. It's good to sort of get some feedback from folks. So, am I missing something, Stuart?
I was just going to ask you to mention that we are trying to wrap up the session signaling, now called DNS stateful operations.
Stateful operations.
We
yes.
have a couple of minor edits to make, but I'm hoping we can do a working group last call in a week or two and move forward on that.
Yeah, I mentioned that in the chair slides, and that's true. We definitely want some folks to look at that because there's a lot of text change. I don't think it's a lot of technical change, but I think there's enough text change that folks need to just make sure that things are flowing. But yes, we want to kick off a working group last call in December for that too. So that's it.
So I think anybody who didn't sign the blue sheets, please do. Whoever does have them, please bring them back to us after you've signed them. And thanks everybody for your time. And we will see you in London. And please don't forget to review drafts and write about them on the mailing list. Thank you.
Thanks. So